Jane's LME Addiction, a Cloud9 Fin podcast where we talk about all things liability management. With me today are Davis Polk partners Hilary Dangle and Brian Resnick. Thank you guys so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us, Jane.
For the benefit of our listeners, I would love if you both could just give a little bit of an overview of your practices at Davis Polk. Hilary, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I'm a partner in the sponsor finance practice here at Davis Polk. I've been practicing at Davis Polk my entire career. I spend all of my time representing our borrower side clients in a variety of financing transactions, whether they be traditional LBOs or distressed transactions as well. And so I spend a significant amount of my time in that space working with Brian and his colleagues on the restructuring side.
Right. Now I'm a restructuring partner. I've been at the firm my entire career as well, 23 years. And I'm also the head of our liability management and special opportunities practice. And so in my time, I started as a typical bankruptcy lawyer and used to call myself bankruptcy lawyer, but obviously that has changed over the years, and now I do restructuring, liability management, et cetera. Split my time between the company side and the creditor side. Hilary and I work together a lot on the company side, sponsor work, et cetera. And I also do a lot of creditor work as well.
I feel like that's unique. I was just going to say, I feel like that's unique that both of you started your careers and are now partners there. I feel like that's
not that unique at Davis.
True. I was actually just going to say, I started my career as a restructuring lawyer. I spent about the first 5 years of my career working with Brian in that capacity. So I think I'm one of a not so small group of finance lawyers who are what we'll call recovering restructuring lawyers. But I think it makes you better to have been on both sides of the aisle for that. I think it makes you a better lawyer, a better drafter.
I would definitely agree with that. As someone who also started off as just a bankruptcy attorney, then when I went in-house, sort of expanded the practice because that's what they needed. Having sort of that like hardcore restructuring beginning was definitely helpful to, especially where we are today with LMEs.
I think it shows you what really matters.
Yes. And so with that, we can dive into sort of the LME landscape, which is, it seems like at this point in time, every conversation that you're having about updates in the LME world is sort of who has the leverage today? Is it sponsors? Is it lenders? What does the market look like? And as part of that, we're seeing new language inserted into documents as that's where it seems to begin. And so, Brian, our topic for today is concentration caps and voting lender caps, or lender voting caps, rather. And so I'd love if you could just give us an overview of what that language looks like and how it plays into the greater LME landscape.
Sure. So I guess to take a step back on the landscape here, we are still seeing a ton of LMEs. They're very active companies, largely private, but also a lot in the public space as well. When they have flexibility in their documents, it's always the thing we're discussing. We rarely, discuss a full-on restructuring or full-on bankruptcy equitization when there's flexibility in the documents to do things. These are for companies who need some combination of maturity extension, liquidity, potentially discount. And so we're very active. We've done or are working on about 30 so far this year. So it still remains, very much alive. And I think we're probably about, 5 years into this trend. It really started in earnest around 2020. And I think the leverage has morphed and changed over time. I think they started as a creditor action, morphed more to a sponsor action, and now it's sort of a lot of both. And so I think sponsors and the lenders, jockey for positions in terms of having negotiating leverage. And what we're seeing now for the topic of today, I think we're seeing a lot of it move to the front end, to the issuance. And sponsors generally have leverage at the front end. I think we remain in a market that's friendly to borrowers. And so at a time when a borrower is healthy and people are not thinking of it as a likely default candidate, I think they have the ability to put language in documents, or at least propose and try to get language in documents that could down the road lead to a better negotiating position if they need to try to do liability management. I think we along the same flavor, we're seeing lender DQ lists that are we've seen 100 lender long DQ lists. We've seen the flexibility to change it and add lenders during the deal. We see anti-assignment provisions prohibiting assignments to certain types of lenders categorically. We see anti-cooperation agreement language. And these are all part of the same flavor to better position a sponsor or a borrower to either have leverage or to have more control over who ultimately is in the credit in case things go south. I think sort of an underlying theme of this is that there are different types of lenders. There are some that are kinder and gentler in a workout situation or a liability management situation, and then there are others that are potentially more aggressive. And giving a sponsor some level of control over potentially either keeping the voting of the aggressive ones down or the or keeping them out of the credit in the first place may be advantageous to sponsors. So I think with respect to the topic of today, the voting the voting cap, it started actually not in this context. It started in the bond context about 5 years ago, where I think, in bonds where it takes 25 or 30% of the note holders to accelerate to exercise remedies upon a default. If you're able to keep any single note holder from holding more than, say, 20%, then you could at least prevent a single holder from aggregating and exercising remedies upon a default situation. I think I think it's being discussed as a potential tool to help manage who's in the potentially the required lender group and the co-op group. So with that, I'll just pause and turn it over to Hillary to discuss the actual provisions.
As the person I was going to say, as the person who actually drafts them.
Yeah. Sure. So you're really voting caps and concentration caps in many ways are kind of two sides of the same coin. And they go to what Brian was talking about, really trying to understand sort of who's in the debt and sort of what they can do with those rights they have in the debt. So a voting cap, as its name suggests, generally is drafted in a way that says that you as a lender, no matter what your economic hold is, can't control the vote for more than X% of the debt. And then to unpack that a little bit, and they're all drafted differently and the words matter every time. But I think the things that you're looking at when you're trying to evaluate a provision like that are obviously one, what is the cap itself? What's the magic number? 20% gets thrown out as the proxy a lot. I think it's possible that we'll see them go lower at some point in time. You might see a different number in different deals, but that's going to be a big part of it. I think when you're looking at one of those, the other things you want to focus on is, who does it really capture? Are you talking about a lender itself? So, effectively the sub-fund who holds the debt or the exposure? Or are you looping in affiliates there as well? Are you sort of looking at the full exposure of a particular asset manager? And then additionally, you're trying to understand sort of what kind of holds are being captured. Is it being lender of record? Is it being sort of known as a participant? Is it being a participant with express voting rights? Is it someone who's a counterparty to a swap? Or does it try to go beyond that to pick up any sort of exposure itself? And then I think the last point that people focus on quite a bit is, does it apply in every case, or can the borrower choose whether or not it applies? I may be biased. I spend all of my time representing borrowers, but I think there is some real wisdom in that. I think, the borrower has the chance to impose that so that a particular lender doesn't carry, I would say an outsized portion of their sway. But nonetheless, they could waive that limitation at any point in time and kind of set you back at square one. Now, I realize someone will say that could be applied disparately. That's true. And I realize someone may say, well, shouldn't your economic position, how can you be disproportionate if you're effectively voting your economic position? But there are times when people have, different interests than the rest of the lender group might have. And I think in that case, they're trying to say, you don't get an outsized vote in anything. Or to the example that Brian was bringing up, a scenario where it takes 50% to waive an event of default, but 25 or 30% to accelerate or exercise remedies. You're trying to make sure that secondary right isn't concentrated in a group that's too small or by a certain holder. And then on the flip side, concentration cap is really something very similar. It is saying that you can only hold so much exposure. So all of the same inquiries apply. What is the cap? What kind of holdings are you talking about? Does it apply to your affiliates? And is it something that the borrower can waive in its discretion?
Are one of those stronger than the other, or is it just sort of, like you said, two sides of the same coin?
I think they are two sides of the same coin. I tend to think, and I'll take DQ lists, and I don't want to jump too far ahead, but take them as an example of a kind of a topic here where there are DQ lists and documents, and then there are many in the market who find ways around them and things like that, or purport to find ways around them. And so if that's the case, then maybe one doesn't have more sway than the other. I would have thought in some ways that voting caps are an interesting one for lenders, because to the extent that they are enforced and they work the way that the borrowers intend them to work, you have a place where your economics are somewhat detached from your actual voting power. And I might have thought that for some lenders, that's, a little bit of a more precarious position to find themselves in. But I think it could just vary from deal to deal and lender to lender.
And so you were saying something about how, some iterations of this language have the ability for the borrower to waive that and to allow a given holder to hold more than that percentage. Are you seeing that as the market standard?
Generally, the ones I've looked at tend to have that provision in them. And I think from a borrower's perspective, I would want to think long and hard in a given situation if I want to put that in without having the flexibility to waive it, because it may be that larger holder who's on my side at some point in time. And that's a right that they always would have had absent this provision, to be on my side and vote that large amount. And so I tend to think it would be a conversation with any borrower that do they really want this in if they don't actually control its application.
And so both of you in your responses have mentioned DQ lists. And so it seems like this is sort of, I guess, three sides of the same coin, where it's sort of, figuring out who you want in your capital structure. And so I guess the question is, do you think that these provisions are either more effective? I mean, we've previously on this podcast had people talk about how DQ lists are totally ineffective and you can still get around them in various ways. For these provisions, do you think that you can still get around them as easily?
So I think what we're seeing very, very recently, as in the last few weeks, is an attempt by some sponsors to draft in language that is meant to capture participations and swaps. In response to lenders, I think finding those ways and maybe others to basically obtain exposure and effectively control a vote from behind the scenes. And I think if that continues to be proposed and finds its way into documents, I think we may find ourselves in a bit of a different landscape. We've seen language proposed that also requires lenders to certify that they're not taking direction on a vote from any participants or from anybody else. And participants and swap parties have in the past basically said, well, we're not in privity with the borrower, so we can kind of do whatever we want. But we've seen sponsors try to address that through language that at least requires the lender of record to make certain certifications. So it's a really interesting question to see whether this approach gains legs and effectively and makes these provisions more effective than they have been in the past, including DQ lists.
No, I think that's right. I mean, DQ lists for a long time have prohibited credit agreements for a long time, I should say, have prohibited participations to disqualified lenders. And also, in their terms, limited the voting rights given to a participant. But I think in practice, the experience has been quite different. And so to Brian's point, whether or not, some level of certification sort of at least gives people a chance to pause and think about, how they want to approach that. I think it's yet to be seen in practice, but I think it at least puts another question out there.
And so while I won't go as far as to say that DQ lists or concentration caps or lender caps or voting caps, rather, are the market standard, we have seen many situations where they've cleared the market, as opposed to anti-co-op language, where we really haven't seen any actual credit agreements. At least at Nineman, we haven't noticed any credit agreements that have actually cleared the market with this, even if they've been proposed. Why do you think that these seem to be able to clear the market, even if they have sort of the effect of preventing how lenders might organize or how they might be able to leverage a situation later on, whereas anti-co-op has not?
I mean, at least the ones where I've tended to see it clear and where it started to clear earliest on were some of the larger deals. And so I say that from the perspective that and I think some of the 9fin publications have talked about, customary holds not exceeding, 10 to 15%. That's not to say that they don't in some deals. They certainly do. But if you're looking at, a large multi-billion-dollar tranche of a term loan, then perhaps 20% doesn't actually concern you that much as a lender, because the probability that you were really going to hold that much was not actually that great, at least out of the gate. And again, not to say that wouldn't happen. It certainly does happen, I'm sure. And like all of these terms, things tend to start out in the larger, more aggressive deals and then work their way into being commonplace. I think that calculus of would you hold 20% is obviously going to be different in a $4 billion tranche versus a $750 million tranche. Even lawyers can do that kind of math. And so, I think like all things there, I think there's a lot of people who look at it and say, well, this is a bit concerning, but is it ever really going to affect me? I mean, frankly, if I were a lender, I think this might keep me up, or at least this would not keep me up late at night as much as, other exposures that might result from flexibility in the credit agreement on a practical level. The other thing I was thinking about a little bit more on the way over here, and, this comes up in a lot of discussions lately on, LME 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, however it may go.
Are we up to 3.0?
But in a lot of cases, you're trying to get a deal over the 50.1% hump, and then you're trying to drive it to 98, 99%. You're not trying to drive it to 75 versus 80%. And so in some of these types of transactions, I think I understand why borrowers want it and want that flexibility, and particularly in the bond context and other things like that. But I think in a lot of these transactions where you're trying to drive, massive amounts of consensus, this is not going to be the thing that holds that up at the end of the day.
Yeah, and Jan, I think cooperation agreements have become very beneficial, in particular to the steering committees. And so I think I could see how, when you look at some of the recoveries in post LME bankruptcies, to the majority lenders, the steering committee members who participated in the LME and got higher recoveries, there's some pretty big difference there. And so I think some of the larger lenders would really not want that language that prohibits co-ops in the first place.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that sort of there's a difference between who's buying these bonds or loans at issuance versus who's holding them at the point where you're negotiating an LME. And whereas like anti-co-op could negatively affect even the initial holders who might have 10 to 15%, if there's a lower sort of concentration in that, and therefore there's less of a chance of a strong steer co necessarily taking effect and having greater fees within a co-op, that would upset initial buyers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
now bringing it back to the voting caps, I do think there's a question of whether it's anti-co-op, and I don't think it's going to have all that much of an effect on co-ops. Maybe mathematically, you have to have more lenders. If there are one or two lenders who hold more than 20%, you may need more lenders to make up a 50.1% vote for a steering committee, if that's helpful and relevant. But again, many deals these days are done for maturity extensions, and you're going to try to get to 100% or as close to it as possible. And so even though you have differentiated treatment, nowadays built into the co-op, with you have the steer co members, and you have the initial lenders, and you have subsequent lenders, and you have people who are not.
Yes, the 4-tiered co-op.
I've seen the 4-tier co-op as recently as last week, and so you may have more lenders who are in the first tier, but I'm not quite sure that's going to stop co-ops from being formed.
And as someone who represents both borrowers and creditors, is the 4-tiered co-op more palatable to borrowers? I know they hate the idea of sort of just like the general co-op. They feel that it, sometimes stifles negotiation, but does that make it better, worse, or the same?
Well, look, I'm not sure the question really matters to borrowers.
Yeah.
Borrowers don't have any say in co-ops. They don't even get to see them or know what's in them unless you guys report on them, as you sometimes do. But most of the time, they're not even public, so they don't know. But look, I think anything that if anything that makes it easier for a borrower to get a maturity extension, if that's what they're seeking, and different levels of discount, ultimately it's sort of a fact of life, right? The co-op takes away their ability to do sort of a tender and try to buy up or get discount from individual bondholders or lenders away from each other. But that's sort of long been taken away with the concept of the co-op. I'm not entirely sure that the 4-tiered versus the 2-tiered or 1-tier is going to make a difference.
And so has anyone proposed to you sort of more effective, an effective way to get that across? I mean, you are, as You mentioned you represent the borrower, so I imagine you're not exactly excited to put in, language that, or either you might be excited to put in like anti-co-op language. Has anyone sort of tried to propose, or have you thought of any language that might effectively pass the market that would have that anti-co-op effect?
We spent a lot less time talking about anti-co-op provisions. I think in part, they are so controversial. And not that we don't want to get them in deals from time to time, but I do think there is a calculus amongst borrowers in terms of what do I really want out of the gate, and what do I want to get from the market and what's important to me. And hopefully that's the part we're not going to focus on. Not to change the question, but the part that I've been thinking about the most in terms of, what would be my tool that I'd actually like to have on the back end of some of these. And it goes back to some of the points we were making about maturity extension. Oftentimes the problem for getting a deal across the line at the end of the day on one of those is not is it the 20 or 25% holder that's holding you up? They've got to be part of that deal to begin with in order to get what you want. But it's the small holders at the end, sometimes holding an older fund saying, I can't roll this debt, or I'm not allowed to consent to extend this maturity, but I don't actually want to blow this up. And frankly, I don't want to get subordinated in this transaction either. And I wish there was a way for me to go along. In Europe, they have the sort of you snooze, you lose sort of negative consent process in some ways. And I know that's sort of touted as being more controversial, but I actually think in the versions of that give a lender the option to opt out, but would also give a lender who actually wanted to go along with the group the ability to sort of say nothing, do nothing, not upset their fund documents in that way, but go along for the ride with everyone. In some ways, like a cleanup sweep at the end could actually be kind of effective there. I realize when they end up in documents, it sometimes grabs headlines, but I think there's actually some real practical uses at the end of the day that are not sort of the nefarious thing that should keep people up at night, but rather actually allow you to get 100% transactions done.
That makes a lot of sense, especially, when you're a bank and you might have all these different all these different units, and you're afraid that, signing on to one might affect someone else. And so you can't really join any ad hoc group, or you can't join a co-op, but you actually do want to be part of the transaction.
Yeah, I've been in situations before for clients of mine where, sometimes what that's resulted is a series of behind the scene trades to people in the larger group who end up taking on the exposure, and people realize a discount, but it's sort of the messaging from those lenders oftentimes who can't participate is, I think this is actually a good idea. I think this transaction can proceed or should proceed, and I'd like to actually participate in it. And it almost might give them a way to do that.
I guess my question for Brian there is, so that happens, right? You get that negative consent, so they're dragged along, or happily, brought along rather.
I like that phrasing.
And then, the company decides to do something later on that these holders don't like. And they say, well, we never really had the option to object in the first place. Do you think that gives them litigation leverage that they wouldn't have otherwise have? Is that why we're not seeing that from an LME standpoint?
I don't think so, because I think Hillary would know how to draft it. So it's pretty clear in the documents that would not give them litigation leverage. I think they would have the opportunity to withhold consent. It's not automatic.
Plus, there's always the magical no action clause.
Exactly.
Yes, that's right.
So I guess, what do you think that we're going to see next? Is it these negative consents? Is it what's next in the world of LMEs and borrowers or creditors trying to gain leverage, whether out of the gate or afterwards?
I think you'll see some of this move its way into the market. I am curious to see when it comes to actual implementations of transactions with omni blockers in it, sort of what that, you could see a controversy popping up there, given some of them are broad or more vague in their application. And when it actually comes to structuring the transaction, how is that going to work out? But I don't think we've sort of seen a test case on that yet, but it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I think LMEs themselves have remained sort of what they've been for the last few years. I know we all sort of came up with some new technology with double dips and pari pluses and stuff. But I think since then, the technology has been largely the same, and it is a matter of leverage. There's the deal away, which becomes more or less prevalent over time. That being the drop down of assets and the company's ability to finance those assets away from the lenders, which remains a helpful threat for the borrower, and it's what gets a lot of these LMEs done with the lender groups. And I think the more of the action among the lenders turning to the co-op stage, I think is what we're seeing with the sort of 4-tiered co-op. Uh, and so I think that's kind of what we're seeing and where things are headed.
Yeah. So LME 1.0 is, the 50.1% gets everything, and the 49% or 49.9% gets nothing. And they have basically no option other than to litigate. LME 2.0 is we're seeing sort of mass participation, even if it's tiered. So LME 3.0 is basically more tiers. Is that?
Yeah, and look, we're also, we're in a world where I think maturity extension has become more and more important as part of LMEs, which drives you to 100% consent. We're still seeing some deals where people litigate. We're involved in one, and Selecta, we've seen that where minority, firstly, note holders have argued that the co-op was a violation of antitrust law, Section 1 of the Sherman Act and New York State's Donnelly Act. So I think we're still seeing deals that don't get done at 100% and parties left out do suit. So it's like sort of a recollection of the 1.0. But yeah, I think largely our deals are getting done usually with the lender group at or close to 100%. It's it's a one-time shot, right? You close the documents with your omni blockers and every other blocker you can, and so post LME, where we are seeing more, hand over the keys, whether out of court or in court, and that's what we're seeing.
And so, just speaking about Selecta for a second, do you think that antitrust litigation is going to in any way deter people from organizing in co-ops? Or do you think that, like any sort of LME litigation, if you plug one hole, it'll just be more careful drafting to make sure that you don't end up in the same exact situation?
Yeah, I think the answer is a clear no. It's not going to deter people from co-ops. Now, of course, if litigation is successful, then we'll have maybe a different conversation. But at least for the time being, while it plays out, it's not going to dissuade people from entering into co-ops.
Well, you've heard it here first.
That's my view. So,
thank you both so much for joining me. This has been so interesting. And thank you for listening. If you have any questions or comments, please email 9fin, podcast@9fin.com.